Hi there. Lindsey Sparks here with the next episode of Read by the Author. Today, we continue Echo in Time, the first book in the Echo Trilogy, read by the author, which is me, Lindsey Sparks. And now, let's return to the story. Chapter 8, Recollection and Recuperation. My apartment door opened, admitting a familiar couple, stumbling and laughing. I was standing in the middle of the cramped living room, watching, helpless to stop what I knew would happen. Panic made my heart race and my breathing quicken. I closed my eyes, incapable of watching, experiencing the horrible incident again. But I could still hear Mike whispering to me, the other me. Desperately, I wished for it to be over. I heard the other me scream, closely followed by the crack of her head striking the steamer trunk and the thud of her body hitting the floor. Now all I have in my head is, let the bodies hit the floor. Come on, brain, focus. There was a crash, an explosive splintering and cracking of wood, and my eyes sprang open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted into obscurity by the light from the hallway. The man who saved me, I realized. As he stepped out of the light and into my apartment, I noticed that the darkness surrounding him hadn't only been due to backlighting. Shadows darker than the night cloaked him, seeming to emanate from him. To my eyes, he was a man composed of nothing but those impenetrable, pitch-black shadows. What the hell? The shadowed man paused after a few long strides, looking at the other unconscious version of me before turning toward the shocked man cowering before him. At least, I thought he looked at the other me. I couldn't actually see his face through the shadows he seemed to be wearing like a disguise. "You!" Mike howled in terror. Shocked, I realized that Mike knew my rescuer. No, no, no! Mike dropped to his knees, groveling. She fell, I swear. I didn't do anything. Confusion and frustration displaced my earlier panic. Who is he? Why can't I see him? It was pretty obvious that he didn't walk around like that, all shadows and menace, outside of the dream, or memory, or whatever it was. Mike had seen him, as had the hospital staff. So why can't I? The shadowed man's steps devoured the distance to Mike in 2 long strides. His midnight-coated arm backhanded Mike, and the smaller man fell to the floor in a limp heap. Swiftly, the stranger moved to the sprawled form of the other me, hovering over her. His hands flew over her body. "Hey!" I shouted, forgetting that I was only watching something that had already happened, forgetting that I couldn't change it. "Keep your hands off her!" His hands gently pulled up her underwear, and from the way the shadows cloaking his face shifted, I thought he must have looked away as he did it. He arranged her black silk dress so she was decently covered before gently rolling her onto her back and touching her wrists. Abruptly, he leaned over her face like he was listening for something. When he sat back on his heels, he brushed a lock of hair out of her face and simply watched her. I moved closer, circling around the man. I searched for a crack in the dense blackness surrounding him, but could find none. From the kitchen floor, Mike groaned, and the shadowed man glanced at him. Gracefully, my rescuer rose. He lurked toward my fallen attacker, spitting vicious, incomprehensible syllables along the way. But something about the words, the language, sounded familiar. I hovered over the other unconscious me while the shadowed man attended to Mike with sharp jabs and swift kicks. I despised Mike, thought I'd lost the capacity to feel pity for him completely. But seeing him being beaten so brutally awoke a sliver of sympathy within me. Did he really drug me? Part of me couldn't accept Dr. Issa's claim, and I was pretty sure it was the same part of me that felt bad for Mike as I watched. Eventually, the shadowed man's need for violence was expended. He sat Mike, head lolling forward, with his back against the wood post, and quickly arranged him so his arms extended behind him. I moved closer. At some point, the shadowed man had produced a zip tie and secured it around Mike's wrists, effectively binding him to the post. Both Dr. Issa and the police had mentioned that Mike had been tied up and in pretty bad shape when he'd been found, alone in my apartment. In fact, I was pretty sure the police wanted to find my rescuer. to arrest him for what he had done to Mike. The severity of his actions hadn't really sunk in until now. He saved me, but he was definitely dangerous. I returned my attention to the shadowed man, watching as he again approached the wounded version of me. Why had he been so enraged? Why had he beaten Mike into unconsciousness? His reaction seemed personal, like he knew me, cared for me, and couldn't let Mike go unpunished for what he had done, and for what he had intended to do. But if that were true, why was he hiding from me? Why hadn't he stayed at the hospital, or at least left contact information so I could thank him for rescuing me? While I wondered about him, the shadowed man picked the other me up easily, like she weighed no more than a child, and carried her through the broken apartment door. Rooted in place, I watched Mike's limp form until the police arrived. According to the wall clock, it took only a matter of minutes. In bed, I felt awareness tug on my consciousness, but I wasn't ready to wake up. I had other plans. A new need was growing. Yeah, it was. Sorry. A new need was growing. A need to never fall victim to someone like Mike again. A need to never again be drugged into oblivion. I focused on that need as I slid back into the dream. I was standing in the middle of a wide-open, tech-friendly office space filled with cubicles and decorated in blues and grays. I was at the New Year's Eve party. A few feet to my right, the other version of me was locked in an embarrassingly brazen kiss with Mike. Ugh. Watching them, I grew so disgusted that I wanted to slap the other me. I felt the urge to tear her away from Mike and shake her and scream, "Open your eyes, you idiot! He's going to hurt you! Run away!" But I couldn't do any of that, and it wasn't for lack of trying. I attempted to pull her away, just as I had attempted to push Mike off her the first time I had dreamed of the incident in my apartment. But she was separated by that same impenetrable barrier I had encountered before. I couldn't touch her. I couldn't touch him. I couldn't touch anything but that damn barrier. I slapped my palm against the barrier separating me from Mike's shoulder. "I hate you," I hissed. For some reason, seeing him before the night devolved into violence was more frustrating than anything I had seen in the other dream. "Happy New Year!" Mike's colleagues hollered from all around me while they kissed and pawed at each other. Mike was leading the other me away. At most, she was tipsy. While he waited for her to retrieve her coat, Mike took out his phone and tapped his thumbs against the screen. I hurried over to him, nearly gagging at his overly cologned stench. I couldn't understand how I had ever been attracted to him. Pushing past the nauseating reaction, I peered over his shoulder at the screen. He was reading a text message from someone named Seth. "Use the lip balm to make her compliant. Then complete the mission." Suddenly awake, I lurched upright in bed, panting. Thora glanced up at me from her cozy position near my hip and meowed quietly. I stroked her soft fur absent-mindedly, thinking about the last dream. Memories of what had happened between leaving the party and stumbling through my apartment door flashed through my mind. Mike kissing my wrist, pulling over to kiss me before resuming the drive, slobbering all over my neck as I tried to open the door to my apartment, obsessively putting on lip balm every few minutes. Use the lip balm to make her compliant, then complete the mission. Based on the text, I realized that Mike's lip balm must have been the source of the substance Dr. Issa had told me about. She had said it only affected a few unique people. Why am I one of those people? Use the lip balm to make her compliant. How had the sender of the text, Seth, known the substance would work on me? And why had he wanted Mike to use it in the first place? My stomach tied into knots as questions swam around my mind. Had some person I didn't know, someone named Seth, instructed Mike to drug me and do whatever completing the mission entailed? Had Mike been instructed to drug me into unconsciousness and rape me? It was too horrible to consider. It was also too preposterous. I'm losing it, I muttered. Laughing at myself over my wild, slightly twisted imagination, I rose from the bed, shuffled to the adjoining bathroom, and examined my reflection in the mirror. Holy crap, I breathed, barely recognizing myself. My brown eyes looked different, like they'd gained a reddish tinge, and my face was washed out and gaunt. Simply based on my appearance, I looked like I was suffering from some ghastly illness, like I was 2 steps away from death's door and already had my hand raised to knock. But I felt fine, if a little weak. And hungry. I squeezed my eyes shut. It's fine, it's just the stress, I told myself, thinking not only about Mike and my physical injury, but also about the identity crisis and the strange dreams I had been dealing with over the past few weeks. Everything is just fine. The words were confident, but my voice was breathy. Turning on the faucet and rinsing my face with cool water, I felt some steadiness return. Eyes still closed, I focused on the delicious smells invading from the kitchen and just breathed. I opened my eyes and stared at my hands. My fingers clutched either side of the rim of the pedestal sink, the tendons standing out sharply on the backs of my hands. I took a deep breath. Again. Finally, I turned and left the bathroom, avoiding looking at the stranger in the mirror. I traded the worn sneakers I had been too tired to remove for fuzzy purple slippers. I added a gray University of Washington sweatshirt to my scrubby ensemble and opened the bedroom door. My mom stood in front of the stove, humming and swaying from side to side. The little kitchen radio played a generic soft rock song. It was the perfect background music to the pops and sizzles coming from the pans on the stove. A junkie of mothering people, my mom was more in her element than I had seen her in years. She almost glowed with purpose. Quietly, I slipped out of the bedroom and crossed the living room to the small rectangular kitchen table. I pulled out my usual chair, the one nearest the bedroom, and sank into its flattened cushion. "Smells yummy, Mom. I'm starving," I said enthusiastically. Startled, my mom spun with her spatula hand extended in front of her. "Lex, you scared me. I didn't know you were up. How are you feeling?" An odd combination of accusation, concern, and contentment filled her face. "Better, I think," I said, scanning the living room and kitchen. "Where's Dad?" She sighed. "He left about an hour ago. He'll call when he gets home." "Oh," I said, disappointment radiating from the single word. Knowing he wasn't my biological father made me second-guess all of my dad's actions. Did he really care as much as I thought he did? Did he really love me? "Stop that, Lex," my mom chided. I looked up at her, wondering for the 1,000th time if she could read my mind. "He thought you'd feel more comfortable with just me for the time being, considering, you know." I nodded as her words trailed off, drumming my fingertips on the table. I wondered how much my parents actually knew about the incident with Mike. I had yet to explain to them what happened, so they had gathered whatever information they had from my friends, the hospital staff, and the police. I took a huge, steadying breath and asked, "Aren't you, curious? About what happened, I mean?" My mom studied me closely before turning back to her stovetop ministrations. "Sweetie, you take your time. Wait until you're ready, and not a minute sooner." She resumed her faint humming. Sighing, I felt both relief and stress. The story had to come out of me eventually, and I dreaded telling it. The longer I waited, the longer the heaping, stinking pile of dread would grow. "Is there coffee?" I asked as I watched my mom's movements. Judging by her arm motions, there were pancakes in one of the skillets on the stove. If there was one thing I truly loved, it was my mom's pancakes, with syrup and butter and bacon. "I made tea," she said over her shoulder. "I thought it'd be better for you, more relaxing." Carefully, she removed crispy strips of bacon and perfectly browned sausage links from 2 pans, leaving only popping grease behind, and set them on a stack of paper towels on the counter. My stomach growled audibly. I didn't think I had ever been so hungry. "Almost ready, sweetie," my mom said as she transferred the mouth-watering meats to a plate. She brought it to the table along with another plate piled high with golden brown pancakes and went back to the kitchen for round 2. When she returned, she carried 2 more dishes, one loaded with a mountain of scrambled eggs, with onions, peppers, and cheese, and the other with oven-fried potatoes. After one final trip, she settled in the chair perpendicular to mine and placed a steaming mug of tea at both of our place settings. "What are you waiting for, Lex?" She gestured to the feast before us. "Dig in." I ogled the mounds of deliciousness. Mom, there's absolutely no way that you and I are going to be able to eat all of this. After scooping some of the scramble onto her plate, my mom looked me square in the eye and said, "Have you seen yourself? Your skin and bones. If I didn't know any better, I think you've lost at least 20 pounds since I saw you 4 days ago. And your face, it's nearly colorless." She shook her head. "Now eat." And eat I did. By the time I sat back in my chair, my stomach was painfully full, and my mom wore a smug expression. All of the eggs were gone, as were the sausage links and strips of bacon. Several pancakes remained, and the potato dish was barely half full. Without realizing it, I had eaten enough for several burly lumberjacks after a hard day's work. My mom smiled, looking as content as a sunbathing kitten. "See, Lex? Your coloring looks better already. A good home-cooked meal can fix almost anything." She gave me a pointed look. "A little sun wouldn't hurt you either." Rolling my eyes, I laughed. "Right, Mom, because there are so many chances to get some sun in Seattle in January." "You could go to a tanning salon." I scoffed. "I will not go to a cancer factory. I'd rather keep my skin smooth and healthy and nicely pasty until I'm Grandma Suze's age." With a long-suffering sigh, my mom raised her hands in front of her in defeat. "Your dad ran some errands for me before he headed back home. He's supplied us with quite a few movies to keep us occupied while you recuperate. Why don't you pick one out? They're over there," she said, pointing to the coffee table behind her. "Really?" I asked, perked up from my food-induced lethargy. If there was one thing I loved as much as pancakes, it was movies. For the most part, I really was a simple soul to please. Author's note, clearly that has dated this book, since now they would just be streaming. So with all the excitement of a child on Christmas morning, I settled on the couch and rifled through a stack of DVD cases. Silently, I thanked my dad for picking movies from nearly every genre, romantic comedy to action, science fiction to period drama. There was a flick for every mood. At the moment, I was in the mood for some rigid chivalry and modest ball gowns. The latest Jane Austen adaptation shimmered in my hand as I placed it in the tray of the DVD player. I lost myself in the music and language of another time. My mom curled up beside me. I slid down, resting my head on a pillow in her lap, and sighed as she started combing through my hair with her fingers. Breathing in her familiar scent of floral perfume and hand lotion, I felt some of the tension seep out of my body. I was so incredibly glad she had stayed. Guess what chapter this is? Doody. Chapter 9. Details and Arrangements. As I strolled along a wet concrete path, I thought back on the last 3 days, savoring the chance to finally get out of my apartment. Alone. My wonderful, caring mom had spent every waking moment stuffing me with her culinary creations and enticing me into watching movies or playing board games. I had barely had time to grade my students' final essays. I loved my mom dearly and appreciated all of the effort she was channeling into my recovery, but I was getting a little stir-crazy. As I passed well-trimmed expanses of grass and mini forests of large evergreens, overgrown blackberry bushes, and abundant ferns, I felt a piece of me, one I hadn't even realized was missing, return. It felt like an eternity since we had set up the meeting, but I was finally on my way to meet Professor Bahur, mysterious archaeologist and user of archaic speech patterns, at the Burke Cafe. I almost couldn't contain my anticipation. I wanted to know everything about the dig and what my exact role would be. I still didn't even know the location of the excavation site. I had left my apartment early, taking the opportunity to turn the half-mile straight shot into a 3-mile zigzag across the university's familiar grounds in hopes that the fresh air might help settle my nerves. Entering the quad from the southeast, I ascended gradual brick stairs, thanking my luck that the morning's frost had worn off by midday. I paused on the top step, taking deep breaths of chilly, humid air. I was still weak, recovering from the unforeseen after effects of the incident with Mike. While my brain had fully healed during the hours spent in the hospital, the rest of my body still looked as if it had been starved for weeks. All of my clothes were noticeably loose, and as I hadn't had much spare bulk to begin with, the weight loss definitely wasn't an improvement to my appearance. At least my mom's dietary plan of continual force feeding seemed to be helping. Breath caught, I resumed my stately pace down one of the brick walkways crisscrossing the quad's lawn. If I were a soaring bird looking down at the rectangular open space with its border of brick buildings, I imagined the site would resemble an enormous stained glass window with emerald panes cut into symmetrical geometric shapes. The usually crowded area was devoid of people, leaving barren cherry blossom trees and the towering brick and stone buildings as my only companions. Their beautiful classic architecture appeased the part of me that yearned to replace modern impersonal structures with those rich in character from earlier centuries. Lost as I had been in my wandering thoughts, I had a sudden moment of panic, fearing that I would be late for my meeting with Professor Bahur, or that I already was. I checked my phone. It was 3:15. Thankfully, I wasn't late. Yet. If I hurried, I might have time to order a vanilla latte before meeting up with him. Apparently, that was my drink of choice at the time. 10 minutes later, I reached the Burke Museum, heading for the entrance to the cafe in the basement. I sighed appreciatively as I opened the narrow glass door. If I ignored the electric bulbs and the scatter of laptop-focused patrons, I could almost imagine that I had stepped back in time. The carved wooden wall panels and the small, dark-stained tables with their sturdy matching chairs belonged in a world gone 100 years. I scanned the cafe, and upon finding that all 3 patrons were women and therefore not Marcus Bahur, stepped up to the counter. "What would you like?" the petite young barista asked. "A tall vanilla latte, please," I said without thinking. "Actually, can you make it a grande? And I'll have a blueberry scone." "That'll be $5.63, she told me. I handed her the money. "Do you know if there's a Professor Marcus Bahur here right now?" Her eyes went wide and her cheeks flushed. "Oh, no, I haven't seen him." I lowered my eyebrows, confused by her reaction. "But you know him?" "Oh, yes. He's been a regular since summer," she explained. Suddenly her eyes narrowed as she asked, "Why? Are you looking for him? What for?" She glanced at the door, then back at me. I put on a friendly smile. "I'm meeting him for an academic project. Would you mind describing him to me? I'm not sure who I'm looking for." Her mouth transformed from pouty to pretty, and she giggled. She didn't speak for a few moments while she retrieved my scone and started making my drink. Finally, she said, "He's, sort of hard to describe." She blushed again while she steamed milk. "Okay. Well, is he tall?" "Yes," she replied with a nod. "Does he have gray hair?" She giggled again. "Definitely not." I was growing impatient with her witless inability to simply describe a person. "Well, what color is his hair, then? Or is he bald?" Her eyes squinted in thought. "Nope, he's got hair." As she handed me my coffee, I grabbed the scone off the counter and muttered, "Thanks." I started to turn away from her, but paused. "How old do you think he is?" As I'd been speaking, her face had grown redder, and her barely contained giggling seemed ready to explode out of her. "Oh, you'll have to ask him," she said. "And how am I supposed to do that if I can't find him because all I know is that he's tall and has hair?" I asked, irritation clipping my words. "Is she even old enough to work?" She managed to squeak, "Be Because he's right behind you, before doubling over in laughter. Squeezing my eyes shut, I took a deep, calming breath before turning around. He was standing several feet away, wearing gray trousers and a heavy black wool coat, and was, in fact, tall, with black hair. My breath caught in my throat as I realized just how minimal that description had been. I had been expecting an older gentleman, but this was a man in his prime, in his early 30s at most, and strikingly handsome. His face was composed of strong lines and sharp angles, his full lower lip the only hint of softness. He had been looking at his phone when I faced him, leaving my embarrassing reaction, blushing and staring, mercifully unnoticed. When his eyes raised and latched onto mine, I nearly dropped my coffee. His irises were an amber so rich they practically glowed. It was an eye color I had seen before, only once. Professor Marcus Bahur was the guy I had spilled vodka and cranberry juice on at the bar. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. As recognition registered on my face, the faintest smirk pulled up one corner of his mouth. I groaned and closed my eyes momentarily. I am so sorry about the drinks and your shirt. I mean, oh my God, this is embarrassing. His mouth widened into a tight-lipped smile. This isn't awkward or anything, I thought. Time for some damage control. I closed the distance between us in 2 short steps and held out my hand, very businesslike. I'm Alexandra Larson. Reaching out, he grasped my hand and shook it firmly. A pleasure, Miss Larson. His accent was as rich and beautiful as I remembered from our brief encounter at the bar. Yes, it is, Professor Bahur. I forced myself not to stare at him like a moon-eyed teenager, which was exactly how I had acted at the bar. As he released my hand, he flicked his eyes to the barista and said, The usual, please. Thank you, Cassandra. To me, he said, Well then, Miss Larson, why don't you pick a table and get settled? I'll join you shortly. Sure. Pleasantly disturbed and highly confused, I wound through the haphazard clusters of tables and chairs to an unoccupied corner. I sat on a bench against the wall, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intriguing professor's interaction with the barista. Cassandra bubbled and chirped nonstop while Professor Bahur waited for his order. He rarely spoke, only providing one-word answers when required, but she was unperturbed. At every shift of his body, she giggled or simpered or sighed. Such a little girl, I thought blandly. I ignored the fact that my body had wanted to respond in an unfortunately similar fashion during both of our brief encounters. Get a grip, I muttered. The director of the greatest excavation opportunity I had ever been offered was a no-flirt zone. I needed to get my ridiculous, unprofessional reactions to him under control. But damn, even though he was still wearing his heavy wool coat, I could tell he was well built. When he moved, every inch of him seemed utterly sure of its placement, like a dancer or a master of the martial arts. I couldn't help but imagine what his body would look like without the clothing, unintentionally leading me to think about it pressed against mine, covering mine, moving against mine. Unbidden, Mike's body replaced the professor's in my lewd thoughts. My heart rate increased dramatically, and my breaths grew short. Miss Larson, are you all right? Professor Bahur asked from across the table. He sat, placing a cappuccino cup and saucer on the wooden surface. I snapped my mind back to the here and now, shoving away all lust or panic-inducing thoughts. Under the professor's steady gaze, I said, Yes, yeah, I'm fine. Thank you. I was just thinking. Like a falcon, he cocked his head to the side and scrutinized me. Sometimes I find that stray thoughts can be quite troublesome. A curse of the intelligent, I suppose. He included me in his undefined intelligent group, with a flick of his hand on the table. I suppose, I said. Or a curse of the cursed. Are you cursed, Miss Larson? His amber eyes were penetrating. I shook my head and laughed softly, thinking of all that had happened during the last month. Maybe? Professor Bahur's expression turned serious. Well, that can be quite an inconvenience when bounding around on excavations and such. Don't you think? One might accumulate more curses than one can bear. I've been on several excavations over the past 5 years, and the curses have yet to interfere with my life. What about you, Professor? He lowered his eyes and studied his cappuccino. Some people are more cursed than others. I coughed, choking on the sip of coffee I had just taken. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. He waved away my concern with his hand. Please, don't worry about me. I've had a long time to learn how to live with my curses. Unsure of how to respond, I took another sip of frothy latte, this time cough-free. I'm very eager to work with you, Miss Larson. I've been reading up on your work. Your piece in the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology was exceptionally enlightening. I brightened, happy to veer toward a less personal topic of conversation. The article he spoke of focused on my unconventional method for deciphering unknown or unclear symbols across dozens of ancient languages using similar, but technically unrelated texts. It formed the basis for my dissertation as well. Thank you, Professor. Honestly, I'm hoping your excavation will provide an opportunity for me to test some of my theories. I think it'll really increase the methodology's validity. I'm certain it will, he agreed, taking a sip of his coffee, which also appeared to be a latte. Now, I'm sure you'd like to hear the specifics of the excavation. Yeah, I really would. He nodded absent-mindedly. Several years ago, I discovered a couple of stone tablets referring to a temple in Deir let's see, I've written this so many times and I don't even know how to say it. Deir el-Bahri. I'm trying to remember how my professors always said it. Deir el-Bahri, I think. Deir el-Bahri. Bahri. I feel like it would have a ch. Referring to a temple in Deir el-Bahri. Now I just sound like I'm choking on my own throat. Several years ago, I discovered a couple of stone tablets referring to a temple in Deir el-Bahri, a temple that, as far as we know, doesn't exist. Or just hasn't been discovered yet, I added. Deir el-Bahri, located on the west bank of the Nile Valley in southern Egypt, was world famous, mostly because the mortuary temple of one of the most famous female pharaohs, Hatshepsut, was located there. The idea that there might be an undiscovered temple somewhere among Deir el-Bahri's steep limestone cliffs was astounding and so incredibly intriguing. Precisely. I am a vampire. Why is that my go-to accent? Precisely. Precisely, he agreed. Professor, if you've discovered an entirely unknown temple there, you've made the find of a lifetime. I was in complete and utter awe of the beautiful creature sharing a cafe table with me, not for his looks, but for his unquestionable intellect. Eyes sparkling, he continued. It gets better, Miss Larson. The temple has remained hidden for so long because of its unique construction. Unlike the three main temples at Deir el-Bahri, ours was designed without majestic colonnades and ramps. The entire structure is supposedly carved into the cliffs. I nodded, trying to comprehend the enormity of the potential find. So it's supposed to be more like the tombs in the Valley of the Kings? I asked, referring to the cluster of tombs located on the other side of Deir el-Bahri's cliffs. He nodded. Based on recent geologic studies, we are fairly certain of the location of the temple's buried main entrance. Now he is French. Based on recent geologic studies, we are fairly certain of the location of the temple's buried main entrance. Main entrance? As in, not the only entrance? The professor's mouth quirked into a mysterious smile, an expression I was quickly growing fond of. You're quick, Miss Larson. Dr. Ramirez warned me of that aspect of your character. Warned you? Last I checked, being quick wasn't a bad thing. Damn, my tongue was going to get me into trouble. Yeah, it is. Warned you? Last I checked, being quick wasn't a bad thing. Damn, my tongue was going to get me into trouble with him. He acquiesced with a dignified nod. You are correct, of course. I must remember not to underestimate you, though your youth and other attributes may lead me in that direction. I kept my face blank, pretty sure my new boss had just insulted and complimented me at the same time. His lips quirked again. Back to the issue of multiple entrances. Sorry. Oh, wow. I'm blushing. So hot and sweaty all of a sudden. His lips quirked again. Back to the issue of multiple entrances. You see, the tablets indicate that our undiscovered temple connects to Jeseru. My mouth fell open and I held up a hand. Jeseru, roughly meaning holiest of holies, was the ancient name of Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. I couldn't believe that the most famous, visited, and explored temple in Deir el-Bahri contained an as-yet undiscovered secret passage that led to an as-yet undiscovered secret temple. You're kidding, right? That's impossible. Professor Bahur stared into my wide, stunned eyes with a complete lack of humor. You're not kidding. Oh my God, you're serious? He raised one eyebrow at my shocked redundancy. Placing both of my hands flat on the tabletop, I said, Let me get this straight. You think you can find a previously unknown temple that connects to Hatshepsut's mortuary temple? He gave a single, minute nod. But that would mean there's an undiscovered secret passageway in Hattie's temple. That site's been scoured by, I don't know, everyone over the past century. It must draw more than 1 million visitors every year. How is this even possible? It would appear, Miss Larson, that Hattie, the corner of his mouth twitched in amusement at my nickname for the famous female pharaoh, was a woman of many secrets. Her stepson and her architect did a very good job of covering them up. Your main role on this excavation is to uncover those secrets, particularly the exact location of the entrance in her temple, as I've yet to have much luck. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I thought, and my nerves hummed with excitement. Professor Bahur had just handed me a task that pretty much every archaeologist would kill for. He made a low, knowing sound. It was annoyingly attractive. Yes, I thought you might enjoy that bit of information. This is unbelievable. Thank you so much, I practically laughed. You are quite welcome. It just so happens that your skill set is precisely what might crack the final riddle. You specialize in deciphering difficult ancient texts. We have difficult ancient texts to decipher, he said cheerily. Do keep in mind that you will need to do a fair amount of research in preparation for our departure. I nodded, brimming with anticipation. I would do almost anything to participate in this excavation. Professor Bahur continued, The university has been kind enough to set aside a classroom on the top floor of Denny Hall for the excavation team to plan and prep. I expect you'll spend most of the winter term there. I'd like you to come by on Monday morning so I can give you a key and introduce you to the rest of the team. Sure. What time? 8:30 should work nicely. Additionally, I've made arrangements with Dr. Ramirez for your graduate duties to be pushed aside. You won't need to teach students or complete any unrelated research projects. This excavation will function as your entire course of study for the next year. I need your focus uninterrupted. Is that acceptable? I was stunned. This enigmatic visiting professor had spoken with my advisor and completely altered the next year of my life before he'd even met me, at least officially. I felt a twinge of irritation that he hadn't consulted with me before rearranging the next year of my life, but the results were amazing enough that I ignored it. Yeah, I think so. Thank you again, Professor Bahur. You're welcome. Again, Miss Larson. I expect your participation will invigorate the excavation. Invigorate the excavation? What the hell does that mean? Along with uncovering the secrets of a long-dead queen, I anticipated uncovering the mysteries behind the confounding man sitting across from me. We discussed some of the more technical details of the excavation over the next several hours. During a lull in our conversation, Professor Bahur glanced around and then said, I'm afraid our meeting lasted longer than I had anticipated, and night has fallen. I'd hate for you to have to walk home alone in the dark. Might I walk with you? Gazing through the narrow, floor-to-ceiling windows on the opposite wall, I found that the sun had indeed set and twilight had come and gone. Oh, I hadn't noticed. Although the idea of a companion on my trip home was tempting, I didn't want to impinge on Professor Bahur's undoubtedly valuable time. You really don't need to walk me home, I told him, but for a reason I didn't understand at all, I wanted him to. I should have been running for the hills after what happened with Mike, but I felt an overwhelming amount of trust for the professor. I shook my head, the barest amount. Yep, I've officially lost it. Professor Bahur lifted his coat from the back of his chair and shrugged into it. Really, Miss Larson, there is a great deal of difference between want and need. I'd expect someone of your advanced academic experience to be familiar with the disparity. Standing, I blushed at the idea of him wanting anything non-academic from me, and used arranging my coat and scarf as a shield. All right, but only if you want to, I said, attempting to keep the teasing tone in the friendly range. I assume, then, that a combination of want and need are acceptable, he said, with a severely polite air, the sharp sparkle in his eyes the only hint of playfulness. One must always keep a watchful eye on those he needs in matters of business, and I couldn't possibly turn down the chance to spend more time in the company of such a lovely, knowledgeable colleague. He indicated the crooked path toward the door with a negligent gesture. After you, Miss Larson. Baffled again by his strange behavior, I slipped between the tables and headed for the door. I made sure to smile at Cassandra as I passed the counter. She glared back, her sour expression turning to honey as she looked at the man following me. Good night, Professor Bahur, she chirped. Cassandra, came his emotionless response, and though I wasn't looking at him, I pictured him giving her the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Once the door closed behind us, I smiled and glanced at the professor. You know, I think you might have just broken her heart with a single word. Yes, well, he said as he looked up into the cloudy night sky, a tired smile playing across his lips. I can't waste time and effort on every woman who desires my attention, Miss Larson. A curse of the beautiful, I suppose. As soon as the words left my mouth, I wished for them back. I was sure I had just crossed a line in our newly established, mostly professional relationship. Professor Bahur chuckled and casually placed his hands in his coat pockets. A curse whose effects you must suffer from every day, he said, before turning to walk toward the nearest concrete path. I stood in place, dumbfounded. Does that man really think I'm beautiful? It was more of a shrug and a, yeah, she's pretty, kind of woman. And I was perfectly comfortable with the fact that I would never turn many heads or stand out in a room full of people. And then I remembered my current appearance, that I looked like I was suffering from gas. From gas? Oh, that looks uncomfortable. And then I remembered my current appearance, that I looked like I was suffering from some ghastly wasting sickness. He's just being nice, I realized. Miss Larson, are you coming? It's most difficult to walk you home when I neither know the way nor have you beside me, he called over his shoulder. I caught up quickly, noticing he had been heading in the correct direction without my assistance. You seem to be doing just fine on your own. I live in the Malloy. Do you know it? Ah, yes. How nice that you are able to reside in such a lovely building. I snorted. I don't know about that. I think it lost most of its loveliness half a century ago. After a moment I said, Professor Bahur, how... Please, call me Marcus, he interrupted. It seems inappropriate for such an accomplished scholar to address me as a student would a teacher. But that's what we are, I countered. Miss Larson, your status as a graduate student is a flaw that I am certain will be corrected by the end of our excavation. Bristling, I recalled how neatly he had rearranged the next year of my graduate career and stopped in my tracks. You know, I can earn my PhD, just like everyone else, with hard work and years of research. I don't need you to do me any favors, and I'd never accept a degree I haven't earned. When he turned to face me, his lips were parted in surprise. He retraced his steps until he stood so close that the condensation in his breath nearly touched me. You misunderstand me, he said evenly. I merely meant that I have great belief in your ability to use the excavation to finalize your degree. After the discoveries we'll make over the next 12 months, I can't imagine the university could hold back on granting your doctorate of philosophy. His nearness and height were slightly intimidating when paired with the chill in his voice. Oh. Might we continue on? He asked. Embarrassed and worried that I had damaged any possibility of friendship, I blurted, I'm so sorry. I overreacted. I shouldn't have. Professor... Marcus, he corrected, and it's already forgotten. Marcus, I agreed with a shy smile. You'll have to call me Lex, then. Very well, Lex. Now, I believe you are going to ask me something, he reminded me as we continued along the path. Oh, yeah. I'm sure you already have a plan for this, but how are you going to clear Hatshepsut's mortuary temple of visitors for months? The SCA will lose a ton of money. The SCA, short for the Supreme Council of Antiquities, was the organization in charge of pretty much everything relating to ancient Egypt. I can't imagine them agreeing to give us exclusive access for the sake of scholarly discoveries. For the first time, Marcus smiled fully, and the beauty of his joy made me stumble. Well, Lex, let's just say that I have friends in high places. Of course you do. Across the street from my building, we stopped, waiting for the crosswalk light to change. You don't need to cross with me. I'll be safe inside in less than a minute. Marcus turned to me, searching my face for something only he would recognize. Need and want, Miss Larson. Need and want. No hint of humor pervaded his words. He is certainly an odd one, I thought, but the sense of safety, of trust, had only increased during our walk. Seconds later, as we crossed the street, I grew increasingly curious about the man beside me. Who is he besides an archaeologist? How did he make friends in such high places? How have I never heard of him? It was as though he'd simply appeared on the archaeology scene last month. That just doesn't happen. We stopped in front of my building's glass door, and Marcus waited while I fished through my bag for my keys. I felt a flash of anxiety as I remembered the last time I had been standing in front of the same door. Seeming to sense my unease, Marcus took a few steps away. Miraculously, with the breathing space, calm returned. I unlocked the door and held it open, with my body half in and half out of the building. Thanks for keeping me company. Any time, he replied with a quick bow of his head. I'll see you bright and early on Monday. I smiled and nodded, retreating into the warmth of the building. For the briefest moment, I wondered what Marcus would have done if I had invited him inside. My mom was still there, so the thought was purely hypothetical. Unfortunately, it triggered more memories of Mike, of being helpless to him, and I shuddered. Silently, I vowed never to date again. Thanks for listening to the Read by the Author podcast. To find out what happens next in the story, stay tuned for the next episode. You can also find Echo in Time, as well as the rest of the Echo Trilogy, in ebook, paperback, and professionally narrated audiobook format through all major book retailers, and libraries too. Until next time, happy reading!